Time now for a check of weather with Nebraska Extension's Eric Hunt. Eric, looks like weather is holding out pretty favorably when it comes to the fall harvest. I understand you've prepared a seasonal outlook, though, for us this week. What can we expect as we work our way through these fall months?
Thanks, Bryce. I do indeed have a seasonal forecast. Depending on your perspective, it may be good news, it may be bad news. Start off, I take a look at sea surface temperatures across the globe. So where we tend to look for our ENSO or El Nino or La Nina signal, we do have some colder waters across a lot of the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. That indicates that we are in a weak La Nina right now. That is expected to continue through the rest of the fall and probably through a good portion of the winter, with better chances of returning back into neutral conditions as we head into next spring. CPC shows for the seasonal outlook for temperature pretty much warm across the entire lower 48, with the exception up near the Canadian border, and generally drier than average for a good portion of the state. Certainly the southern plains and the mid-south region, they are painting as dry. Equal chances across the eastern side of the state, wetter as we get toward the Pacific Northwest. Now again, this is what I'm going to show you here for the next few slides are generally based on historical precedent for El Nino and also what we see in some of the seasonal forecasts. The drought outlook shows drought developing across the southern plains throughout most of the south. I do think there's going to be some chance of seeing some more drought developing across portions of the Midwest, particularly to our east. We've had a pretty good amount of moisture for most of the state here this fall. Granted, September's been a pretty wet month for the state of Nebraska, and I think the drought risk is a little bit lower this year than it has been in the fall. But if we turn over really, really dry in October, November, then we may see some portions of northeastern Nebraska turn back into drought. Looking at the upper air pattern expected through the early portion of November, the European model shows a troughing being more persistent here across the Gulf of Alaska, which would mean more ridging here across the central and western portion of this continent. And if that's the case, that will keep us relatively warm and dry. Again, now historical precedent also show in years where we've had a developing La Nina and also a negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, we do tend to see this trough here across the Gulf of Alaska, more ridging here across the western and central portion of the continent. That tends to lead to a more northward storm track and warmer and drier conditions across our region of the country. Now again, this does not mean it's going to be like this every single day. I do think there'll be opportunities to get some cooler air and maybe some moisture in. I do not anticipate us being as dry in October this year as we were last year, although I don't think it'd be very hard. I don't think it'd be very hard for it to be wetter than it was last year in October. In terms of precipitation anomalies going through the middle portion of November, the European Weekly show very dry across pretty much the entire central portion of the U.S., including all of Nebraska. And historic precedent would suggest that most of the Gulf Coast, Mid-South region is pretty dry, also showing a pretty dry signal here across the central plains and into a lot of the western Corn Belt. So again, there are portions of northeastern Nebraska that have been relatively dry here the last 30, 45 days. So if we do remain relatively dry here for the next 6 weeks or so, I do think there will be a little bit of drought worries to contend with in this region. In terms of temperatures, looking at relatively warm temperatures above average being expected pretty much the entire region of the country. And historic precedent also suggests that we probably are likely to remain pretty warm through at least a good portion of November. Now again, this does not necessarily mean we're going to be really, really warm every single day, or at least compared to average. I do think there'll be opportunities to get some cooler air in here, maybe later portion of October. But as a general rule, we are likely to remain mild through at least the next several weeks. I do think there's a chance, though, based on historic precedent and some signals we're seeing in the global models, that we may see that pattern shift as we head toward winter. And historic precedent would suggest that years with La Nina and this negative phase of PDO, we can sometimes get a signal that does bring down some much colder temperatures here into the north central U.S. And here's the summer temperature and precipitation extreme for the summer of 2025 in the state of Nebraska. Back to you, Bryce.